0400 hours. August 17, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. The first light of dawn barely touched the Bavarian sky when the air raid sirens began to scream. Workers at the Kugelfischer ball-bearing plant dropped their tools, rushing toward shelters as the ground trembled with a distant growing thunder. Over the horizon came the glint of hundreds of silver shapes, their formation tight, their engines beating like a single metallic heart. They were B-17 flying fortresses of the United States Army Air Forces, massive bombers carrying not just high explosives, but a new doctrine of destruction aimed at the very machinery of the German war machine. U.S. Army Air Forces Mission Report, Aug. 1943. From below, the German civilians and factory crews stared upward in disbelief. Never before had their city, home to the lifeblood of Nazi industry, been struck at such scale. The hum of lathes and presses that had powered the Reich's armies was about to be silenced by an enemy strategy that went far beyond battlefields. As flak guns opened fire, black clouds blossomed in the sky, but the bombers kept coming, rows upon rows, their course unshaken. The target was not soldiers, not tanks, not even airfields. It was ball bearings, the small, gleaming steel spheres that made every gear, axle, and engine in the Third Reich turn. For the men and women inside Schweinfurt's plants, the sound of falling bombs was not just destruction. It was revelation. The enemy had found their weakness, and now that weakness was under siege. Bundesarchiv Factory Diary Entry, Aug. 1943. The year was 1943. Across Europe, the tide of war was uncertain. The Wehrmacht remained entrenched from France to the Soviet Union. German panzers still prowled the fields of the Eastern Front, while U-boats hunted convoys in the Atlantic. But America, newly ascendant in the war, sought not just to meet the enemy tank for tank or gun for gun. The United States believed it could strangle Hitler's war machine by cutting off its most fragile artery, industrial production. And in the world of precision engineering, nothing was more essential than ball bearings. Without them, tanks would grind to a halt, trucks would stall, and aircraft propellers would seize mid-air. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The logic was cold, mathematical, and merciless. One factory could determine the fate of entire divisions. German engineers had built a war of machines, Panzers with Maybach engines, Messerschmitt fighters with Daimler-Benz power plants, artillery hauled by Opel trucks. Every one of them relied on bearings, from the smallest rotating hinge to the largest armored drivetrain. In theory, destroy those factories, and the German army would collapse not from enemy fire, but from mechanical paralysis. Schweinfurt became the bullseye of this strategy. 5 major factories in the city produced nearly half of Germany's ball bearings. Among them, Kugelfischer AG and Vereinigte Kugellagerfabriken, VKF, dominated the Reich's supply. These plants were not hidden bunkers or secret laboratories. They were sprawling industrial complexes, easily visible from the sky, humming with tens of thousands of skilled machinists, toolmakers, and engineers. They were, in Allied eyes, the perfect target. Air Ministry Target Intelligence Report, July 1943. But targeting them would come at a price. To reach Schweinfurt meant flying deep into enemy airspace, well beyond the range of fighter escort. American bombers would face swarms of German interceptors, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, waiting like wolves in the clouds. Flak batteries lined the approaches, spewing steel into the sky. And yet U.S. commanders pressed forward, convinced that a decisive strike could shorten the war by years. On that August morning, the plan was executed. 2 waves of flying fortresses, some 376 aircraft, thundered across the German countryside. Each carried up to 8,000 pounds of explosives. The formations stretched for miles, their shadows crawling over farms and villages. Civilians paused in fields, pointing upward, wondering if their homes would survive the day. For the bomber crews inside, the world was a coffin of steel and noise, oxygen masks hissing, machine guns bristling from every turret, radios crackling with terse commands. Mission debrief. First bomb group, Aug. 1943. At 10:30 hours, the first bombs fell. Schweinfurt shuddered under a storm of high explosives. Roofs peeled away like paper. Cranes toppled, furnaces were torn apart. Molten steel spilled into the streets, mingling with dust and smoke. Workers who had minutes earlier been machining precision bearings now stumbled through rubble, their world reduced to twisted girders and broken glass. One survivor later recalled the roar as, like the tearing of the earth itself, eyewitness testimony, Schweinfurt Archive, and yet, not all went as planned. German flak gunners found their range, punching holes through the bomber streams. Fighters darted in, firing cannon shells that shattered B-17 fuselages. Crews bailed out over countryside and city alike, parachutes blooming as their comrades watched from above. The Americans lost 60 bombers that day. Over 600 men killed or captured. U.S. 8th Air Force Loss Report, AUG 1943. The price was staggering. Still, the damage to Schweinfurt was undeniable. Workshops were shattered, machinery destroyed, production delayed. The Reich's Ministry of Armaments scrambled to assess the blow. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Industry, later admitted that the raids revealed Germany's Achilles heel, Speer Memoir, 1969. For the first time, the war had reached into the precision heart of the German economy, but even as smoke still rose from the ruins, German workers began to clear debris, salvage machines and restart production. Engineers improvised, relocating machinery to basements, dispersing assembly lines to smaller towns. Within weeks, output began to recover. The Reich was wounded but not crippled. The Americans had struck hard, but the question remained: could they sustain such attacks given the immense cost in planes and men? For those who survived the raid, both German and American, the lesson was clear. This was not just a clash of armies. It was a war of industry, fought with lathes, blueprints and factories as much as rifles and tanks. And the ball-bearing plants of Schweinfurt were now the central battlefield in a hidden war of production. Yet a deeper question lingered. Why had the United States risked so much for these raids? Why had Schweinfurt, an obscure industrial town, become the center of a grand strategy? The answer lay not just in the rubble, but in the invisible machinery of war. The tiny steel spheres without which an entire empire's engines would grind to a halt. The world was about to learn that the smallest components could decide the fate of nations, and, in the shadows of Schweinfurt's smoking ruins, a far more dangerous second strike was already being planned. September 14, 1943, dawn over eastern England. The airfields of the U.S. 8th Air Force stirred with a grim determination. Mechanics tightened bolts, checked oxygen lines and loaded bomb racks in silence. The losses from the first Schweinfurt raid had been staggering, yet orders were clear. The ball-bearing plants must be hit again. For American commanders, this was not just a bombing mission. It was the pursuit of a hidden weapon, one that did not fire bullets or drop shells, but could choke an enemy's entire war effort by attacking the smallest but most vital parts of its machines. U.S. Army Air Force's Operations Order, Sept. 1943. The secret factor was not a gun, nor a plane, nor a bomb. It was logistics. American planners understood that industrial warfare was a machine of infinite gears, and that each gear depended on a tiny, polished steel sphere. Without bearings, tanks became immovable hulks. Aircraft engines overheated and seized. Trains sat useless on their rails. To cripple Germany's supply of ball bearings meant reducing the Wehrmacht's mobility to a crawl. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The Germans had assumed their factories were too dispersed, too vital to target effectively. They underestimated the Americans' resolve and the scale of U.S. industrial might. American factories, powered by engineers like Henry Ford's assembly lines in Detroit, produced not only bombers and fighters, but the tools to carry out long-range strategic warfare. Factories in Pittsburgh and Cleveland forged the bombs, while companies like Sperry and Norden refined bomb sites capable of striking within hundreds of yards from miles above. Norden Bomb Site Technical Report. To 1943, the ball bearing itself was deceptively simple: hardened chrome steel, heat-treated for resilience, ground with precision to within fractions of a millimeter. In Schweinfurt, machines designed by German metallurgists turned out millions each month. Each bearing ranged from a marble-sized sphere for typewriters to larger bearings essential for tank drivetrains. The Kugelfischer plant alone produced 15 million units monthly, much of it destined for aircraft production at Messerschmitt's Augsburg works. Reich Armaments Report, July 1943. To Allied strategists, these factories were the pulsing heart of the German war machine. On September 14th, The second great raid on Schweinfurt commenced, later called Black Thursday. 291 B-17. Flying fortresses lifted off in waves, their propellers slicing through fog. Each carried a payload of 5,000 pounds, mostly general-purpose bombs designed to collapse roofs and shatter machinery. The crews were briefed: hold tight formations, rely on interlocking fire from 50 caliber Brownings, and trust in the precision of the Norden bomb sight to strike the factories directly. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1943, but the Germans were waiting. Radar stations detected the American formations minutes after takeoff. By the time the B-17s crossed the Rhine, the Luftwaffe had assembled over 300 fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, armed with 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns. Luftwaffe Fighter Command Diary. Sept 1943. At 12:30 hours, the air above central Germany became a storm of steel. German pilots dove through the formations, cannon shells ripping through wings and engines. Bombers exploded mid-air, fireballs tumbling toward the earth. Others limped, trailing smoke, their crews frantically manning waist guns. The escorts, limited-range P-47 Thunderbolts, had been forced to turn back near the border. The B-17s were alone in hostile skies. Still, the mission pressed on. Over Schweinfurt, bomb bay doors opened and tons of explosives cascaded downward. The Kugelfischer plant was struck heavily. The VKF facility sustained catastrophic damage. Workshops leveled, assembly lines mangled, warehouses reduced to rubble. German workers fled or fought to rescue comrades trapped beneath girders. In minutes, months of precision production had been obliterated. Bombing Assessment Report, 8th Air Force, Sept 1943. The price, however, was devastating. Of the 291 bombers dispatched, 60 were destroyed outright. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair, and nearly 600 airmen were killed or captured. Air crews dubbed it Black Thursday, one of the most costly missions in American air power history. U.S. 8th Air Force Loss Report. Sept 1943. For the Germans, the raid was both a disaster and a revelation. Production dropped by 38% in the following months. Entire tank battalions reported shortages in replacement parts. Aircraft factories struggled to meet quotas as engines failed without bearings. Speer himself later acknowledged that if such raids had been sustained, the Reich might have faced collapse by 1944. Speer Interrogation Report. 1945. Inside Germany, disbelief spread among workers and commanders alike. How can they know? One Kugelfischer engineer supposedly asked. Why would they waste so much to strike us? We are not soldiers. We are only makers of small steel balls. But in those words lay the truth. War had shifted from battlefields to workshops, from trenches to machine shops. Technically, the raids represented the apex of precision warfare in the 1940s. Each B-17 bristled with 1350 caliber machine guns, weighed over 54,000 pounds fully loaded, and could climb to altitudes above 25,000 feet. Their four Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines delivered 1,200 horsepower each, carrying the plane's nearly 1,800 miles round-trip, Boeing Production Spec Sheet 1942. Inside, the Norden bomb sight allowed bombardiers to adjust for altitude, wind, and drift, releasing bombs with a claimed accuracy radius of 300 feet. For its time, it was the most advanced targeting system ever deployed. Bombardier Training Manual 1943. And yet the raids revealed the limits of technology. Precision in theory was often chaos in practice. Smoke, flak bursts, evasive maneuvers, all scattered bomb groups and widened bomb patterns. Some bombs fell short into residential neighborhoods, igniting fires and killing civilians. Others missed entirely, cratering fields far from their intended targets. For the air crews who survived, the images of burning cities haunted them long after they returned to England. The Americans were learning a brutal lesson. Even the most carefully planned strike could exact unsustainable costs without fighter escort. Losses of 20% in a single mission meant that entire bomb groups were nearly erased. Pilots scrawled farewell notes before missions, aware that statistics alone might condemn them. The air war was as much psychological as physical. Crewmen aged years in months, their nerves frayed by constant raids and the ever-present spectre of fire and flak. Combat Stress Report, 1944. Yet despite the carnage, The technical gamble was working. German production lines faltered. The Wehrmacht's repair depots reported delays. Tank brigades stood idle waiting for replacements. And Luftwaffe maintenance units cannibalized aircraft for parts. OKH Logistics Report, OKSI 1943. For the first time, Germany's vast war machine felt the strain of industrial strangulation. But the Americans could not yet see the full picture. German ingenuity countered every blow. Factories dispersed operations into basements, tunnels, and smaller towns. Output, though reduced, never collapsed completely. By December, bearing production had rebounded to 80% of pre-raid levels. The Reich had survived its industrial heart attack. Speer Production Report, DEC 1943. Still, the raids on Schweinfurt marked a turning point in strategic bombing. They proved that industry itself was a battlefield, that engineers and machinists were as critical as tank crews and pilots. They also revealed the cost of striking deep into enemy territory, without adequate protection. The skies over Germany had become a killing field, where courage alone could not guarantee survival. And so as 1943 drew to a close, a chilling question loomed. Had the Americans truly found Germany's Achilles heel, or had they bled themselves chasing a mirage? The answer would depend not only on bombs and bearings, but on the arrival of a new weapon, one that could finally escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. Winter, 1944. The skies over Europe were changing. For months, the American daylight bombing campaign had battered German industry, and nowhere had the strain been felt more than in the shattered workshops of Schweinfurt. Yet the question lingered. Were the raids a decisive blow or a costly gamble that drained the US 8th Air Force as much as the Reich? The answer lay not only in destroyed factories, but in the strategic, psychological, and lasting legacies that emerged from the battles over ball bearings. US Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The raids of August and September 1943 had revealed a brutal truth. American bombers could inflict immense damage, but without escort fighters capable of flying to the target and back, losses were unsustainable. In Schweinfurt, commanders saw both triumph and tragedy. Production had been slashed, but bomber crews were decimated. Generals debated whether the campaign was a success or a mistake. In the words of one US officer, "We cut their throat, but we nearly bled out ourselves." 8th Air Force Debrief, 1943. Relief came with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. Sleek, long-ranged and deadly, the Mustang could escort B-17s and B-24s deep into the heart of Germany. Powered by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could reach speeds of 437 miles per hour, climb to 41,000 feet, and crucially, had the fuel capacity to follow the bombers all the way to Schweinfurt, Berlin or beyond. Technical Manual N0160JE1. Signed 1944. With its arrival, the balance in the skies shifted. Now, when Luftwaffe fighters rose to intercept, they found Mustangs waiting, diving upon them with 650 caliber Browning machine guns. For the bomber crews, it was as though angels had appeared, delivering them from slaughter. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. The Luftwaffe's strength began to crumble. Experienced aces were lost in growing numbers. Replacement pilots were rushed from training schools with fewer hours of instruction. Fuel shortages, exacerbated by the Allied oil campaign, meant squadrons could no longer fly daily missions. A diary entry from a German fighter pilot, later found in the wreckage of his Bf-109, captured the despair. "We rise to fight, but they come in endless waves. The bombers do not stop. The Mustangs do not leave. It feels like drowning in the sky." Bundesarchive recovered pilot journal. Back in Schweinfurt, the human toll was staggering. Thousands of German civilians had been killed or wounded. The city, once a hub of precision engineering, became synonymous with ruins and fire. Workers who survived the raids continued production in dispersed facilities, small workshops hidden in forests, underground tunnels carved into mountains, even barns converted into machine shops. Women and forced laborers replaced fallen men, working under constant fear of the next raid. Reich Labor Deployment Report, 1944. And yet, the raids inflicted more than physical damage. They struck at morale. In letters intercepted by Allied intelligence, factory workers wrote of exhaustion, hopelessness, and anger at a war that had turned them into targets. British Intercept Report, 1944. For civilians, the message was clear. No part of the Reich was safe. For soldiers on the front, the consequences were more subtle but just as dire. Tanks delayed, aircraft grounded, spare parts rationed. Every breakdown in the field could mean defeat, and increasingly, those breakdowns were linked to the shortages caused by Schweinfurt. Strategically, Schweinfurt became both a lesson and a warning. The Allies had proven that striking industrial bottlenecks could cause systemic disruption, but they had also learned the limitations of air power. Even under devastation, German industry adapted. Ball bearing production never fully ceased. By dispersing factories, relocating workers, and improvising repairs, Speer's ministry managed to restore output to near pre-raid levels by mid-1944. Speer Production Report, July 1944. The Germans had absorbed the blow, but at tremendous cost in resources, manpower, and morale. The Americans, too, had changed. After Schweinfurt, daylight bombing doctrine was refined. Mass formations remained, but with Mustang escorts, losses dropped dramatically. Precision bombing continued, but now it was complemented by area bombing from the RAF at night, creating a round-the-clock aerial siege. Germany became a nation under perpetual bombardment. For Schweinfurt survivors, the sound of engines overhead became as constant as the church bells once had been. In the months that followed, the focus shifted to oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, and transportation hubs. Yet Schweinfurt remained a symbol, a demonstration of both the potential and the peril of strategic bombing. The debates that began in 1943 echoed long after the war ended. Had the raids shortened the conflict, or had they been an unnecessary bloodletting? Historians argued, veterans remembered, and survivors carried scars invisible and visible alike. Post-war assessments revealed chilling insights. German officials admitted that the raids on Schweinfurt had terrified them more than many battlefield defeats. They feared that if the Americans had sustained the pressure, returning month after month, Germany's war effort might have collapsed within a year. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Instead, the pauses between raids gave them breathing space to recover. It was not the hammer blow that killed them, but the grinding attrition of combined campaigns that eventually broke the Reich. For the United States, Schweinfurt was a crucible. The courage of the air crews, the sacrifices of engineers and factory workers back home, the relentless pursuit of innovation, all converged in the skies above Bavaria. It showed that modern war was not won solely by armies in trenches, but by machinists in Detroit, engineers in Seattle, and scientists in hidden labs who designed engines, alloys, and targeting devices. Every rivet and bearing mattered. The legacy carried forward into the Cold War. The idea of striking critical nodes, factories, power plants, command centers, became central to nuclear strategy. Precision-guided munitions, stealth bombers, and network-centric warfare all traced roots back to Schweinfurt's fiery lesson, that in the modern age, industry itself was the battlefield. When Iraqi tanks stalled in the deserts of 1991 for lack of spare parts, or when precision strikes in Kosovo shut down infrastructure without full-scale invasion, echoes of Schweinfurt could be heard, and for those who lived through it, the memory was indelible. American veterans spoke of endless formations, of comrades lost in smoke and fire, of missions that felt like flying into the jaws of death. German survivors recalled the roar of collapsing buildings, the taste of dust and blood, the sight of children digging through rubble. One survivor, interviewed decades later, whispered simply, "It was as if the world itself had turned against our little city." The raids on Schweinfurt were not a single victory or defeat. They were a revelation. They showed that the smallest components could determine the fate of the largest machines, and that in total war, no factory, no worker, no town was beyond the reach of destruction. They revealed both the power and the limits of air strategy, teaching lessons written in fire across the skies of Europe. And as the war marched toward its final year, one truth became undeniable. In the struggle of nations, it was not only generals and soldiers who carried the burden of fate. It was also the hands that forged the bearings, the minds that designed the engines, and the courage of those who flew through walls of flak to silence the machines of war. In Schweinfurt, the hammer of history fell hard. It did not break the Reich outright, but it cracked the foundations. And from those cracks, the collapse of Hitler's empire would one day follow. War is not won by battles alone, one American strategist reflected. It is won by breaking the enemy's ability to move, to supply, to fight. And sometimes all that requires is stopping the smallest wheel in the machine. U.S. Army Air Force's analysis, 1945.